The Greatest Generation is the personal memoir of a British 6th Airborne paratrooper, Albert Victor Childs, who fought throughout the Second World War. This account was compiled by and read by me, Albert Jack.
Operation Overlord, otherwise known as the D-Day landings, was a huge-scale invasion of northern France in 1944 by Allied forces in order to rid that country, followed by the rest of Nazi-occupied Europe, of totalitarian domination. Having taken the decision to counter-invade and to confront Hitler's army on the ground, it was agreed that a combined force of parachute and glider troops from the British 6th Airborne Division would lead the invasion of Normandy by landing at key inland locations well behind the Nazi front line. Their initial objective had two important elements. The first would be for the parachute soldiers to set up a defensive perimeter or bridgehead which would prevent the enemy, waiting in reserve a little deeper into the French countryside, from reinforcing their own fortification at the Normandy beaches and subsequently mounting a counter-attack on the exposed Allied landing forces. In effect, the parachute regiment would be dropping behind the first line of German defence in order to isolate them. And this was critical. If the 6th Airborne soldiers had failed to stop German Colonel Hans von Luck and his 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, who were in position just a few miles east of where the Paras would be landing, from counter-attacking, then the entire D-Day landing operation would probably fail. The second main objective was to secure vital river crossing points that would enable the much larger seaborne invasion forces to push past the paratroopers and establish stronger, safer defensive positions away from the exposed beaches. The Allied plan was to enable a massive seaborne invasion force to attack the isolated German defences on the beaches and then quickly push past to link up with the established British Airborne Division further inland. Other objectives for the airborne units were to attack and destroy the heavy German gun batteries that also threatened to inflict massive damage to the troops landing on the beaches. One of these was the feared Merville Battery. This crucial part of the invasion plan was codenamed Operation Deadstick. Prior to Overlord, preparation and repeated rehearsal had been going on all over Britain, with men and women rehearsing and revising their roles. As new ideas were developed, new units were created to carry out specific operations, and one of these had been the 6th Airborne Division, formed on May 18, 1943, and under the command of General Richard Gale, otherwise known as Windy. In a basic but effective piece of subterfuge, the division was called the 6th Airborne simply to confuse the enemy intelligence officers into believing Britain already had 5 others, when in fact there was only one other, the 1st Airborne, commanded by Major General F. Browning. Within a year, the new 6th Airborne Division would become one of the most acclaimed British infantry divisions of all time. Operation Overlord was initially scheduled to commence on the 4th of June 1944, but bad weather delayed the campaign by a single day. German commanders, however, expecting the imminent Allied attack, calculated the weather forecast for some days ahead to be too poor for the British and Americans to attempt any assault. Some of them even gave themselves a few days off and returned to their families. Their assumptions would be wrong, because late in the evening of the 5th of June 1944 a squadron of Dakota aircraft filled with paratroopers, and with 6 Horsa gliders on tow behind them, took off from RAF Tarrant Rushden in the south of England. Ahead of them were the pathfinders of the 22nd Independent Parachute Company, who had been detailed to mark the drop zones with beacons for the pilots to locate in the darkness. Once on the ground, individual units set about their prearranged tasks, some of which had very tight time limits and with grave consequences should the Paras fail to achieve their own given objectives. For example, the Merville gun battery, which had an awesome capacity and protected the beaches codenamed Gold, Juno and Sword, was to be silenced by the men of the 9th Parachute Battalion. So critical was this part of the operation that if they failed to do so, the British Navy cruiser HMS Arethusa would open fire on the position at 5 a.m, wiping out any paratroopers in the area, and they were all aware of that. The 4 7mm guns themselves were protected by a 10-foot concrete shield and were thought to be capable of sinking any ship or landing craft heading for the beaches they overlooked. The RAF had tried and failed
Sample complete. Ready to continue?